and welcome to Developing Story. I am Tim Reidy, Executive Editor here at America Media. As the story of the clerical sex abuse continues to rock the U.S. Church, we look to a country that has been dealing with the repercussions of its own sex abuse scandal, Australia. Cardinal George Pell is currently facing charges of sexual abuse, the highest-ranking official in the Vatican ever to be prosecuted. And anger about the crisis has escalated so much that the government is now pushing for priests to violate the seal of the confessional and report instances of child sexual abuse heard during confession. The Church has also been threatened with the revocation of its nonprofit tax status. Where does the Australian Church go from here, and will the U.S. Church soon be facing the same issues? Joining me to discuss these issues is Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane, Australia. Welcome, Archbishop Coleridge.
Thank you very much, Tim. By the way, it's Brisbane, not Brisbane.
Well, good morning to you. I know it's about 14 hours ahead, so thank you for joining us at this early hour. As we begin today's discussion, I want to take this moment to remind our viewers that you can send us your questions and comments through the story through Facebook or Twitter, and we will try to answer as many as possible here live. Now, Archbishop Coleridge, I just listed some of the challenges you're facing in your country. Obviously, we're facing some of the same challenges here. Maybe you can give us a sense of what the mood is among Catholics in your diocese and in Australia, since you're the president of the Bishops' Conference.
Well, I think the dominant mood probably is a sense of bewilderment, really, because this is a crisis the like of which we haven't faced in our history. And I think many people are struggling to make sense of what's going on. This was certainly true of the Royal Commission that we had, where there were different understandings of what the Royal Commission meant, how to respond to it, and this was true in the process of finalising our response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So there's a sense of bewilderment, a sense of uncertainty about the future, the need for reassurance. There is also, I think, a sense of betrayal, and with that inevitably comes anger, even a sense of outrage. But look, in the midst of it all, there is also, I think, in Australia, a depth of faith that may have been shaken, but it hasn't been destroyed, and a sense of hope for the future, because I think it's clear that the leadership of the Church, at least, and there's more to the Church than the leadership, but the leadership of the Church is prepared to act, and we've been very clear in saying that, look, the time for words is over. Now is the time for action. And that was what our response to the Royal Commission was all about last week. It's also what the Plenary Council is all about, and that is an important part of us plotting a course into the future. So things like the determination to act, the decision for a plenary council, all of those, I think, are sources of hope. So it's a strange time that none of us saw coming, a time both of bewilderment, uncertainty, anger, and yet in the midst of that faith remains, and there are glimmerings of hope. So it's a very complex and intense moment in the life of the Church, and one the like of which we've never seen before. So we're in uncharted waters, and I suspect that's true of the Church in the USA. Yes. There are similarities between the Church in the USA and the Church in Australia, but it would be wrong to see them as identical. It's a bit like US culture and Australian culture. They look rather similar, but in fact, when you get to know them a bit, and I've spent some time in the USA, you see that there are important differences. But there are certain points of convergence. I think what we are going through is not necessarily what the US will go through. It's not as if we're further down the track. I don't believe that at all. And some of the pressures within the USA, I think, are unique to the USA, one of which is a quite dramatic polarisation in the Church in the USA. Now, we have elements of that here, but nothing quite as dramatic and intense. So there are important differences, but certainly we in Australia are following developments in the USA very closely because they have an impact on the Church around the world. And that's clear too, that Australia, which is very distant and small, but what is happening in the church in Australia has implications for the church right around the world. And the people in Rome know that, which is one of the reasons why they're following the story here in Australia very closely. And I'm in regular dialogue with people in the Vatican. The Vatican has set up a working group on Australia, and it's with that group that I am in dialogue, because, again, they know that what's happening in Australia is not unique to Australia. There are Australian modulations, as there are in the US, but it's not unique, the drama, to Australia or to the USA.
Now, you mentioned the Royal Commission report on sexual abuse. This has been years in the making, I believe, back to 2013. But this is, correct me if I'm wrong, looking at the problem from a national perspective. Do you find that perhaps there's an advantage to that, whereas here in the United States we're looking, we have a report from this state or from this diocese, and it tends to kind of prolong the crisis? Is there an advantage to looking at everything kind of from a holistic perspective, like's going on now in Australia?
There's a great advantage, but there are great challenges too. Now, the challenges are very real in Australia, where we have 7 jurisdictions. Like you, we are a federation. It would be far more complex in the USA when I forget how many states have you got, is it 51?
50.
Trying to coordinate 51 jurisdictions would be a nightmare. It's been hard enough in Australia, and remains hard enough, to coordinate 7 jurisdictions where each jurisdiction has its own laws, particularly in this area of child protection. So trying to do anything in a coordinated way in Australia is extremely difficult. I sometimes think that Australia in the singular doesn't exist, that really it's a plural, Australias, and much more so perhaps than meets the eye. But I think it's more dramatically the case in the USA. But if it could ever be attempted on a national scale, I think there would be great advantages. There certainly were here. And there's a determination now to work harder at the business of coordinating a response around the nation. In other words, not having this fragmented and at times contradictory response, particularly in an area as vital as child protection. So there are advantages in the national response. There are enormous challenges. There have been for us, and there would be even greater challenges, I imagine, in the USA.
Yes. You talked about the different jurisdictions. If we could focus on the issue of the question of the seal, the confessional. My understanding is that some of those jurisdictions have moved ahead with trying to strip those protections. Is that correct?
That's right. They have. 2 or 3 of them have already passed laws basically abolishing the seal of the sacrament. Others are signalling that they'll do the same. And I think there is a determination among the lawmakers in the different jurisdictions to have a national coordinated response on a thing like this. Now, we have made it clear that that's the one recommendation of the many recommendations of the Royal Commission that we were unable to accept. It's not just that we didn't accept. What we said was we could not accept that recommendation for reasons that we gave briefly in our response document and have been given elsewhere at greater length. But in the end, what we said is that we don't see the seal of the sacrament and the safeguarding of the young and the vulnerable as mutually exclusive. And in fact, in some ways, to abolish the seal may even make children and vulnerable people less safe rather than more safe. We also think that there are massive questions of practicability. How is this to work on the ground? And my own sense is that it's law being proposed or passed by people who don't understand the way the sacrament happens on the ground. If I, as a priest confessor, have someone come to me and confess anonymously to having abused a child whose identity I do not know, so I don't know the identity of the perpetrator, I don't know the identity of the victim, and yet I'm supposed to go to the police and say, well, someone confessed to abusing someone. So there are massive questions about practicability, but also at the heart of it, the question of will this in fact make children safer? Another thing that intrigues me, Tim, is that there's almost an obsession with this issue, as if the Church does not abolish the seal of the sacrament, nothing has changed. Now, I think that's absurd, and various commentators have said that if you listed 100 things that would in fact make children safer in this country at this time, the seal of the confession and its abolition would come almost at the bottom of the list. And yet there is this, certainly in sectors of the media, there's an obsession with the seal and also with mandatory celibacy for clergy. So that what they imply is that if you don't abolish mandatory celibacy, if you don't abolish the seal of the sacrament, nothing has changed. Now, I disagree with that very strongly. I think the bishops and the religious leaders have committed strongly and clearly to change, and change is clearly needed. In the end, it's a change of culture, but that doesn't happen magically. It means changes of many other kinds in order to change the culture. But we have a long way to go on this question of the seal. There'll have to be some serious discussion and negotiation with governments, I suspect, but we regard the point as non-negotiable. Now, because one of the difficulties canonically is that if I as a priest confessor violate the seal, I am ipso facto excommunicated. So if I break the seal, I'm excommunicated. If I don't break the seal, I break civil law. So we have a question as acute as that, and it's a question that has been referred obviously to the Holy See, right, who are intensely interested in the question of the seal because, again, it concerns the Church Universal.
Yeah, this is a subject we're following very closely and with great interest. I wonder if you can speak to, as the president of the Bishop Conference, at this, as you say, really this momentous time in the history of your church, what are you and your brother bishops seeking to do to kind of help reach out to people and to kind of, maybe try to salvage the image of the church in people's eyes?
Well, it's not just a question of the image of the church, Tim, I think. It goes far beyond image. I mean, our credibility has been hugely undermined. Certainly the moral authority of the bishops has been eroded massively, I would have to say. And this at a time when we're dealing with very important questions concerning life and death, abortion, of course, and euthanasia is now emerging as a major issue. So at a time when the voice of the bishops potentially becomes more important, in fact, our authority has been, and we have to accept that our authority has been undermined, and therefore it's not just a matter of brushing up our image or any kind of spin. In fact, what it does mean is we have to become the church that we're called to be. So there's a call to conversion that's both individual and communal. We have to become the church that we are called by Jesus Christ to be. Now, that's not going to happen overnight because there have been profound betrayals and a corruption of the identity of the Church of Jesus Christ. So first of all, we have to identify those failures and those corruptions with eyes wide open. And then we have to take action, not just to beat the breast and offer endless apologies that never land. We have to take action that is going to lead to genuine change, not in a corporate sense, but in a way that's appropriate to the church. So the other thing about people like me, bishops and leaders, is to listen to the people, to listen to their pain. First of all, to listen to survivors. And until you've done that, you don't know what you're dealing with. Years ago, it was the thing that turned my sense of things on its head. So to listen to the survivors, but listen to the pain and the uncertainty, the bewilderment of people in the pews as well. So that's the most important thing, I think, for bishops and religious leaders at this time, really to have ears that are genuinely open and can hear what's going on in the community and also read the truth of our own heart, because there's a bewilderment and a sense of betrayal in the heart of bishops and priests as well. All of us have been wounded by the abuse crisis, all of us in one way or another. So to be sensitive to that and not to live in a world of denial or defensiveness or fantasy of some kind. To deal with the reality with ears wide open and to be patient. Now here I'm echoing Pope Francis because he talks about a synodal church as a listening church. Well, that's what we've got to learn in a new and deeper way. But he also talks about the need for patience, that there is no quick fix, there is no magic bullet. This is a long and complex and at times painful journey of conversion. I don't know what better word to use. And it is going to take time. So we need that combination of passion in our commitment to act, but patience, given that it will take time.
We have one question from social media that's related to this. This is from Kieran on Twitter. How can the Church regain the trust and support of Australians after the wrongs that have been committed? So you spoke a little to that, but maybe you can point to, are there any signs that you mentioned earlier in our broadcast, any signs of hope, or people are starting to maybe try to reach out and have a, maybe better engagement with the Church?
Well, again, I think it's going to take time to build trust, and it won't. There's no sort of magic answer to the question of how trust will be built. But let me just say that people often say the Church needs to apologise. We have apologised 1,000 times here, but the problem is the apologies never land because trust has not been restored. And until there is a genuine restoration of trust, no apology is going to really land or hit the mark. So that's one of the facts we have to accept. Now, restoring trust will only come over time if, in fact, we do the things we say we're going to do in this response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission. If we make those commitments and then don't follow through, trust will be even further eroded. So the only thing that I can see that will restore trust is action. I mean, first of all, courageous decisions based upon a sense of the facts, and then on the basis of those decisions, a willingness to act no matter what the cost, and I don't just mean financially, no matter what the cost of that action. Now, one action we have already decided for is the plenary council that I have already mentioned. Now, that's a conciliar journey under the influence of the Holy Spirit. And again, I think the Holy Spirit is hugely caught up in all of this. One thing I've said a number of times publicly is that it seems to me that two things that happened in 2013 converge in a strange and important way. The first was the beginning of the Royal Commission, and the second is the coming of Pope Francis to the papacy. It seems to me in their very different ways, the Royal Commission and Pope Francis are in fact summoning the whole Church, certainly in this country, to a kind of conversion, to become not a new kind of church, but become the church we were always called to be. In other words, be faithful to the vision of the church that we find in, for instance, the Second Vatican Council. So that I do think that the decision for the plenary council, under the influence of the Holy Spirit, again, you can't leave the Spirit out, but that decision, I think, is a sign of genuine hope. And I think in Australia, many people, not everybody, but many people would see it as such. But if I could just come back to the question of God. The Royal Commission didn't do God and couldn't do God. It was a secular instrument of its nature. But its secular eye upon the life of the Church was extraordinarily important and helpful. But that's why, because they didn't do God, inevitably at certain points, there's a one-dimensional feel about the way they see the Church, the priesthood, the sacraments like the seal. Now, we as the Church obviously have to do God. So that's where it's not a tension, but there's a difference of perspective that the Royal Commission and many of the responses to it have to exclude God. And if you do exclude God, you say a whole range of things. But if you have to include God, as we do, you end up saying things that are a bit different on questions like the seal, celibacy, the life of the church and how it should be governed and so on. So I think the question of God is an important one. And if we're looking to build trust in the future, again, we can't just put a line through God and saying we, like the Royal Commission, will not do God. We have to do God in the process of rebuilding trust.
Of course. Now, just one last question. You mentioned a little earlier about the kind of the parallels that we're facing in this country. Since you're speaking primarily to an American audience here, are there any words you would have for us in terms of how we, what strength we can draw as we go through this crisis of our own?
Well, it must be a most intense and difficult time. I mean, I know quite a few of the bishops in the US, and inevitably I feel for them, but I feel for the entire Catholic community in the States, because you are a great church, and in many, many ways the Church Universal depends upon the strength of the Catholic Church in the USA. And by the strength, I don't mean your financial power or your political clout. I mean, you have been a big and powerful church. And through all of this extremely painful purification, the church in the US may become smaller. I don't necessarily mean numerically, because you'll always be big numerically. But you may become and may have to become, like us in Australia, a smaller church. In other words, a humbler church, a purified church, a church that is able to listen and not just speak. And again, to use the word of Pope Francis, a church that is more profoundly and genuinely synodal. But for all that feels dark and even desperate in the USA, I would simply say, never underestimate the gifts that you have been given as a church. Gifts not just for yourself, but for the whole church around the world. The church in the US is a great church, and whatever the horrors of this current time, nothing can change that. And those gifts that God has given, not your own achievements, but the gifts that God has given, He doesn't take back. They're still there. The question now is how to allow those gifts to flourish in a new way so that the church will become a smaller, humbler, more synodal community of faith, a faith made stronger precisely by the kind of suffering that you're undergoing right now.
You can go to americamag.org/abuse, and you can subscribe to America's YouTube channel. Archbishop Coleridge, we want to thank you again for joining us and wish you, of course, our prayers are with you.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's been great to speak.